For centuries, the pyramids of Egypt have been icons of the human story. We call Egypt the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of kings and dynasties, the foundation of written history. But what if new scans of the pyramids uncover ancient civilizations hiding beneath Giza? What if the pyramids are not the beginning of civilization, but merely the visible tips of something far more extraordinary hidden beneath the sands? Before we descend into the shadows of the ancient world together, I'd love to know where you're joining me from tonight. Drop a comment with your current time and location. Let's see how far this mystery reaches across the globe. For over 4,000 years, the Great Pyramids of Giza have stood as monuments to human ambition. Their limestone faces weathered by countless desert storms, yet steadfast in their silence. Consider this: the Great Pyramid is aligned almost perfectly to true north, a margin of error so small that it would challenge even modern surveyors. The structure encodes dimensions that correspond to the Earth itself: the length of the year, the curvature of the planet, even the distance to the Sun. Was this coincidence? Was it luck? Or was it intentional? The work of minds that possess knowledge far greater than their supposed time should allow. The desert is deceptive. To the untrained eye, it is an empty sea of sand stretching endlessly beneath the burning sun. But sand is not just emptiness, it is concealment. It covers, it buries, it hides. What if we have misunderstood this place? What we see of Egypt may not be the full story, but only fragments that survived the passage of time. We've measured every stone, mapped every passage, and catalogued every chamber, or so we believed. This is why the new discoveries matter. If beneath the Giza plateau lies evidence of hidden chambers, spiral staircases, and vast underground networks, then the story of Egypt is not what we thought. It is not a story of a civilization inventing greatness, but of one inheriting and perhaps failing to preserve the legacy of something much older. Textbooks tell us the pyramids were built around 4,500 years ago, during the 4th dynasty. That narrative presents Egypt as the starting line of civilization. Yet, as explorers and archaeologists have long noticed, many of the mysteries around the pyramids do not fit so neatly into that story. The size of the stones, the precision of the alignments, the engineering challenges that even today remain staggering. Its sides rise at an angle of 51 degrees, cut so carefully that its base deviates less than inches across its vast perimeter. The structure weighs some 6 million tons, each block carved, transported, and placed with uncanny accuracy. The traditional story tells us these stones were dragged by hand on wooden sledges, lifted up ramps of mud brick by thousands of labourers working under the desert sun. But no evidence of such massive ramps has ever been found. No remnants of tools capable of cutting granite with diamond precision have been recovered. And if such a workforce existed, the records of Egypt, so meticulous in their inscriptions of battles and decrees, are strangely silent on the logistics of such a monumental task. Could it be, as some have whispered for centuries, that the pyramids are not the work of the civilization we credit them to, but the inheritance of something older? What if Egypt's most enduring monuments are not a first chapter, but the last surviving echo of a forgotten age? This is not a new idea. Ancient Greek historians such as Herodotus, writing thousands of years ago, recorded stories told to them by Egyptian priests. Stories of cycles of destruction and rebirth, of floods that swept away entire worlds, of ages that rose and fell long before the dynasties we now study. In Egyptian mythology itself, there is the tale of Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age when gods walked among men, when civilization flourished before being wiped away, leaving only fragments behind. To Orthodox historians, these are myths, symbolic tales meant to explain origins. But what if they are memories, distorted through time, of a real forgotten epoch? And if such an epoch existed, could the pyramids themselves be its surviving relics? For over 2 centuries, explorers and scientists have attempted to answer these questions. Every generation brings new tools. Today, we have lasers, thermal imaging, and ground-penetrating radar. The Great Pyramid has been scanned by satellites, by robots, even by cosmic rays. And yet, for all that effort, the mystery has only deepened. Rather than revealing everything, technology keeps exposing more questions. Anomalies, cavities, unexplained heat spots, strange alignments. It is as if the pyramid resists being fully understood, revealing just enough to intrigue, but never enough to satisfy. So why does the pyramid matter so much? Why do people return to this monument again and again, searching for answers? Because the pyramid is not just stone. It is a question in the shape of a mountain. Its existence demands an explanation. Its builders must have had knowledge, mathematical, astronomical, architectural, far beyond what textbooks claim. For centuries, the desert has whispered secrets to those who would listen. Now, with new scans, those whispers are becoming clearer, and what they are beginning to reveal may shake the foundations of history itself. But perhaps they are also monuments of warning, a message from a world before ours, a world lost but not forgotten. The pyramids have always stood as monuments of awe, but never before has science had such powerful tools to peer beneath the sands. In the past, explorers had to dig, chisel, and crawl through narrow shafts with torches and lanterns, hoping to stumble upon hidden chambers. Today, archaeologists bring instruments so advanced that they can see through stone itself. This is the new frontier of exploration, non-invasive archaeology, a way to uncover the past without disturbing a grain of sand. And it was this promise of revealing secrets long buried that brought a team of international scientists to the Giza Plateau in March 2025. The expedition was led by Professor Corrado Malanga from the University of Pisa. Malanga was known not just for his work in archaeology, but also for his daring approach to questions others avoided. Alongside him stood Filippo Biondi, an expert from the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. Together, they were armed with technology originally designed not for history, but for the future. Synthetic aperture radar, or SAR. Synthetic aperture radar works on a simple but profound principle. Imagine shining a flashlight into a dark room. The beam bounces off objects and returns to you, revealing what your eyes alone cannot see. SAR does the same, but with electromagnetic pulses. These waves penetrate deep into rock, sand and soil. They strike hidden structures, echo back, and are transformed into three-dimensional images. To the untrained eye, the results look like strange patterns of colours and lines. But to those who know how to read them, SAR can paint a picture of entire worlds buried beneath the earth. Caves, tunnels, ruins of cities long erased from the surface. SAR had been used to probe the crust of planets, to map the moon, to peer beneath the frozen deserts of Mars. It was a tool meant for space exploration. Now, for the first time, it was being turned on one of Earth's most enduring mysteries, the pyramids of Egypt. And if the pyramids hid something, if beneath their massive foundations lay hidden chambers or structures, SAR was the tool that could reveal it. On the morning of March 12, 2025, Malanga and his team set up their equipment at the base of the Pyramid of Khafre, the second largest of the Giza monuments. The desert sun rose hot and merciless as they calibrated antennas, adjusted frequencies, and prepared the radar for its first sweep. The air was thick with expectation. For decades, researchers had speculated about voids beneath the pyramids. Some claimed there were hidden chambers, others that there were entire subterranean complexes waiting to be discovered. But most attempts to prove such claims had ended in disappointment. Anomalies that could not be explained, patterns that vanished under scrutiny. Would today be different? Would the sands finally yield their secrets? When Professor Malanga and Filippo Biondi arrived at the Khafre pyramid with their SR equipment, they were expecting to add perhaps minor footnotes to the vast catalogue of existing knowledge. But as the morning sun climbed higher over the ancient stones, something extraordinary appeared on their screens. The first pulses were fired into the earth. Waves of energy sank into limestone, penetrating hundreds of meters. Computers hummed as the echoes returned, translating invisible ripples into colourful 3D maps. At first, the team expected to see nothing more than subtle density variations, natural cracks, minor voids, geological noise. But then, something began to take shape on the monitors. A spiral, not a random swirl, not the messy chaos of fractured rock, but a deliberate, perfect spiral etched into bedrock. Its curves were consistent, its proportions exact. As the data accumulated, more spirals appeared, 4 in total, winding deeper into the earth. The scientists stared in silence. They were not looking at geology, they were looking at architecture. Malanga leaned in, examining the formations. These were not accidents of nature. These were patterns of design, as deliberate as the staircases of a cathedral. But the radar was not finished. As the scans extended, new shapes began to appear. Vertical shafts, descending straight into the bedrock. Perfect cylinders, plunging down over 2,000 feet. 2,000 feet, a depth greater than any cathedral tower, greater than any skyscraper of the ancient world. Smooth, uniform, engineered with precision that modern machines would struggle to replicate. The spirals and shafts were connected. The spirals were not just patterns. They were staircases, winding descent paths, wrapping around the vertical voids. It was as if the earth itself had been carved into a labyrinth, a vast system of tunnels and corridors spiraling into the abyss. The team was electrified. No one had expected this. SAR had revealed anomalies before, but never with such clarity, such undeniable geometric perfection. What did it mean? Who could have carved such massive structures, hidden so deep below one of the most studied monuments on Earth? And more importantly, why? To descend 2,000 feet into solid bedrock would require technology, manpower, and knowledge beyond what historians attribute to ancient Egypt. The labor alone would have been staggering, the purpose unimaginable. The desert had spoken, but it had not given answers. It had given a deeper question. That night, as the team gathered to review the data, the air buzzed with tension. Some whispered comparisons to ancient myths. Others worried about the reaction from the academic world. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. And these images, no matter how compelling, were still Delta, still open to interpretation. But Malanga was certain of one thing. This was not geology. This was architecture. And the story they were beginning to uncover was far larger, far stranger than anything they had imagined when they first pointed their radar toward the stones of Giza. And this was only the beginning. The first images emerging from the radar scans left the team in silence. On the screen before them, the strange spirals grew more distinct, winding deeper into the bedrock with every pass. To those trained in geology, the patterns made no sense. To those who studied architecture, they were unmistakable. These were not cracks, not fissures, not accidents of nature. They were deliberate, they were planned, and they carried with them the unmistakable fingerprint of human design. Professor Malanga leaned forward, studying the glowing outlines on the screen. The spirals were smooth, consistent, and symmetrical. Each one descended in a perfect curve, wrapping around vertical shafts that plunged into the earth. He whispered words that would later become infamous. This is not geology, this is architecture. At that moment, the atmosphere in the tent shifted. The team of researchers, technicians, and assistants realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was no longer a routine survey. This was history being rewritten, live on their monitors. The shafts themselves were staggering. More than 2,100 feet deep, they stretched far below the pyramid foundations. Their dimensions were so vast, so precise, that even modern engineers would struggle to replicate them without heavy machinery. But the Egyptians, according to conventional history, had none of this. No steel drills, no diamond saws, no cranes, no advanced surveying tools. And yet here, below the sands of Giza, were structures that defied all of those limitations. The spirals were staircases, access routes. The shafts were elevators into darkness, entrances to a subterranean world. Imagine the descent. Ancient workers carrying torches, winding down the spirals into the deep. The flicker of firelight against carved stone walls. The echo of footsteps vanishing into chambers far beneath the desert floor. What purpose could such structures serve? Storage? temples, tombs, or something else entirely? The team exchanged theories. Some believed the spirals and shafts could be ritualistic, symbolic of a journey into the underworld. Others speculated they were practical, ventilation systems, or hidden access points to protect sacred treasures. But the dimensions told a different story. These were not narrow passages or small chambers. They were monumental, colossal. Malanga called up comparison images on the monitors. He showed the Empire State Building, one of the tallest skyscrapers in the world. He overlaid its height against the shafts revealed by SAR. The Empire State was smaller. The shafts were deeper. The room fell silent again. No one spoke, but the implications were clear. Whoever built these underground systems was not merely carving tunnels. They were constructing something on the scale of modern megastructures, something hidden beneath the sands for millennia. Some of the younger assistants struggled to accept what they were seeing. They argued that radar can produce false positives, that density anomalies in limestone could create illusions of patterns, but the evidence kept piling up. The spirals were too consistent, the shafts were too smooth, and beyond them, faint outlines of chambers began to emerge. Rectangular, cubic, geometric. The monitors were beginning to reveal a subterranean blueprint, a map of a city beneath the desert. One of the technicians whispered, "It's like someone built an entire world down there." The implications were staggering. If these were indeed man-made structures, then the story of Egypt, and of human history itself, would have to be rewritten. The pyramids were already the most studied monuments in the world. For centuries, they had been explored, measured, and mapped in exhausting detail. To suggest that beneath them lay hidden structures of such magnitude was nothing short of heresy to mainstream archaeology. But the radar did not lie. The spirals, the shafts, the chambers, they were there, and with each new scan, the mystery only deepened. The spirals and shafts were astonishing enough, but as the scans continued, a new shape began to emerge. Faint at first, barely distinguishable against the noise of the data, then clearer and clearer as the algorithms refined the echoes. Rectangles. Perfect, sharp-edged rectangles. Beneath the spirals, beyond the shafts, the radar was detecting chambers, huge cavernous spaces carved with mathematical precision. The team stared at the images in disbelief. This was no random anomaly. This was a room. Professor Malanga adjusted the filters, highlighting the outlines. The chamber was vast, 80 meters on each side. To put it into perspective, that is nearly the length of a football field. The volume could hold Olympic swimming pools or entire city blocks of smaller structures. And this was just one chamber. As the scans spread outward, more appeared, cubic spaces linked by corridors aligned with uncanny precision. The underground complex was beginning to take shape before their eyes, like a blueprint resurrected from the earth itself. The scientists whispered to one another, each trying to comprehend the scale of what they were seeing. For years, speculation about hidden rooms beneath the pyramids had been dismissed as fringe theory. Now, the data showed something far greater. Not a hidden room, not a secret passage, but an entire world beneath the ground. The corridors appeared to connect the chambers in a logical pattern, like hallways in a modern complex. Some angled toward the pyramid itself, as if the structures above were directly linked to what lay below. The implications were staggering. The pyramids were not isolated monuments standing alone on the plateau. They were entrances, gateways, surface markers of something buried far deeper. One assistant asked the question on everyone's mind, how could this be here? And no one ever found it. The answer, of course, was simple. The desert hides everything. Sand shifts, layers build, time erases. For thousands of years, the focus of explorers had been on the visible structures above ground. Few had the tools to look beneath, and those who speculated about what lay below were dismissed as dreamers or charlatans. But now, the scans gave form to those whispers. The chambers were real, the corridors were real. The underground city was no longer speculation. It was appearing in vivid detail on their screens. The team could hardly keep up with the data pouring in. The chambers were mapped, one after another, until the pattern became undeniable. The subterranean world stretched outward, beneath the plateau, far beyond the boundaries of the pyramid foundations. Some of the corridors extended for hundreds of meters, bending at right angles, forming grids like streets of an invisible city. Others plunged deeper still, suggesting multiple levels, a labyrinth descending into darkness. Speculation erupted among the team. Could these chambers have been burial vaults for kings older than the dynasties we know? Could they have been repositories of lost knowledge, libraries of stone-holding records from a vanished age? Or were they something even more extraordinary, the remnants of a civilization so advanced, so forgotten, that even the Egyptians themselves inherited their ruins without understanding their origins? As the team analysed these connection patterns more closely, they discovered perhaps the most sophisticated element of the entire network: subtle linear formations that appeared in the radar data as channels designed to direct the flow of water. These waterways connected every major component of the underground network, suggesting not merely a series of storage chambers, but the remnants of a sophisticated water distribution system designed to supply an entire subterranean city. Some channels followed natural slopes, directing water flow through the most efficient paths. Others cut directly through bedrock in ways that indicated advanced mathematical knowledge of hydraulic principles. The radar even detected signs of controlled water erosion in certain areas. Not the chaotic damage of floods, but precise erosion patterns suggesting these channels had functioned as designed for extended periods. It was overwhelming, a network of architecture that dwarfed anything above ground, hidden in silence for thousands of years. The myths of Zep Tepi suddenly seemed less like legends and more like memories, the tales of gods walking among men, of a first time when knowledge and power flourished might not be fantasy at all. They might be history. For the scientists, the discovery was both exhilarating and terrifying. If the chambers were real, they had just stumbled onto one of the greatest archaeological finds in human history. But with it came a burden. Proof would be demanded, skepticism would be fierce, and the implications were almost too vast to imagine. Still, as the team stared into the glowing outlines of spirals, shafts, and chambers, they knew one thing for certain. They were no longer simply studying pyramids. They were looking into the depths of another world, a world buried beneath Egypt, a world that might hold the key to humanity's forgotten past. Yet, as news of these extraordinary discoveries spread through archaeological circles and into the broader media, the response revealed as much about academic politics as it did about scientific methodology, and the resistance that emerged would cast long shadows over the future of pyramid research. In the rarefied halls of Egyptology, where reputations are built on decades of careful scholarship, and careers can be destroyed by a single, misinterpreted artifact, Professor Malanga's radar discoveries landed like seismic shocks. If confirmed, these underground chambers would represent the largest archaeological discovery since the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, with the potential to rewrite the entire understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. Yet rather than sparking the kind of excited scientific collaboration that such momentous discoveries typically inspire, Malanga's findings met with a wall of institutional resistance that seemed to grow stronger with each passing week. The most vociferous opposition came from Dr. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Minister of Antiquities, and arguably the most influential voice in pyramid research, a man whose opinions could make or break archaeological careers with the weight of his pronouncements. Dr. Hawass's response was swift and unambiguous. In carefully worded statements to international media, he dismissed Malanga's claims as fake news, insisting that no official permits had been granted for such investigations on the Giza plateau. The spiral patterns and chamber formations detected by the radar, he argued with the authority of someone who had spent decades studying every stone of the ancient complex, were simply misinterpreted geological anomalies, natural features of the limestone bedrock that had been confused for human construction by researchers unfamiliar with local conditions. These are not chambers, Hawass declared in interviews that would be broadcast around the world. What they are seeing is natural geology, nothing more. The limestone of Giza has many natural voids and irregularities that can appear artificial to those who don't understand the stone. His dismissal carried the weight of institutional authority. This was not just one expert's opinion, but the official position of Egyptian archaeology itself. The academic establishment rallied around Hawas's position with remarkable unanimity. Lawrence Conyers, a respected archaeological geophysicist from the University of Denver, raised more measured but equally skeptical concerns about the technological limitations of ground-penetrating radar at such extreme depths. Current scanning equipment, he pointed out in published papers, becomes increasingly unreliable when attempting to map structures more than a few dozen meters below the surface. The vivid computer-generated images circulating in media reports, Conyers emphasized, were interpretations of raw electromagnetic data rather than actual photographs of underground spaces. The claimed precision of architectural details at depths exceeding 2,000 feet pushed far beyond the boundaries of what current radar technology could realistically detect with confidence. What appeared to be geometric precision in the processed data might simply represent the mathematical artifacts of computer algorithms attempting to interpret ambiguous signals from deep within the Earth. Other experts joined this chorus of technological skepticism, noting that electromagnetic pulses traveling through dense limestone could be scattered, reflected, and distorted in ways that create false patterns in the resulting data. Natural geological processes, the movement of underground water, variations in rock density, ancient seismic activity, could all potentially create signatures that might appear artificial when processed through sophisticated analysis software. The academic establishment also emphasized the absence of peer review, that crucial cornerstone of scientific validation that separates legitimate research from speculative claims. Without independent teams confirming Malanga's results using different methods and equipment, the discoveries remained scientifically unverified, regardless of how compelling the initial data might appear. The extraordinary nature of the claims, critics argued, demanded extraordinary levels of verification before the archaeological community could accept such radical revisions to established knowledge. This pattern of institutional resistance reflected deeper currents within academic archaeology, a field where revolutionary discoveries have historically faced years or even decades of skeptical scrutiny before gaining acceptance. The examples are numerous and sobering. When Heinrich Schliemann claimed to have discovered the ruins of Troy in the 1870s, mainstream scholars dismissed his findings as wishful thinking, insisting that Homer's Iliad represented pure mythology rather than historical memory. It took generations of additional excavation to confirm that Schliemann had indeed uncovered one of archaeology's greatest prizes. Similarly, when Howard Carter first announced the discovery of Tutankhamun's intact tomb in 1922, prominent Egyptologists questioned whether such an undisturbed burial could actually exist, given centuries of systematic grave robbing in the Valley of the Kings. The discovery seemed too extraordinary to be real, until Carter's methodical excavation revealed treasures that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Yet the resistance to Malanga's discoveries carried undertones that went beyond normal scientific caution. The vehemence of Hawas's denials, the speed with which institutional positions hardened, and the apparent unwillingness to authorize even limited verification studies suggested concerns that extended beyond questions of technological reliability or scientific methodology. For observers watching from outside the academic establishment, the pattern seemed uncomfortably familiar, the kind of defensive reaction that emerges when new evidence threatens to destabilize carefully constructed theoretical frameworks. If massive artificial chambers really did exist beneath the pyramids, their implications would cascade through decades of established scholarship, potentially invalidating countless papers, books, and academic reputations built on assumptions about ancient Egyptian capabilities. The skeptical response also highlighted the political dimensions of archaeological research in Egypt, where discoveries are not merely academic matters, but touch on questions of national identity, cultural pride, and economic interests. Revolutionary findings that might suggest Egypt's greatest monuments were built by unknown predecessors rather than indigenous Egyptian civilization could challenge narratives that serve important contemporary functions. To some, it was a huge discovery. To others, delusion. As the months passed and the initial excitement over Malanga's discoveries faded from public attention, the academic resistance seemed to have achieved its intended effect. Without official permission for verification studies, without peer review publication in major archaeological journals, and without the endorsement of established authorities like Hawass, the radar findings drifted toward the margins of serious scholarly discourse. Yet the data itself remained unchanged by academic politics. Somewhere in computer files and research archives, the electromagnetic echoes from deep beneath Giza continued to suggest the presence of massive artificial chambers, regardless of whether the archaeological establishment was prepared to acknowledge their existence. Yet even as these academic battles raged in conference halls and scholarly journals, another mystery was quietly unfolding in what archaeologists had long considered the most transparent and thoroughly understood section of the entire Giza complex. The Western Cemetery of Giza stands in the long shadows of the pyramids, its neat rows of mastaba tombs marching across the limestone plateau like ancient barracks frozen in time. For over a century, these rectangular limestone structures have been mapped, measured, and catalogued with meticulous precision. Each mastaba tells a familiar story, the eternal resting place of an old kingdom noble, carefully positioned according to royal favour and social hierarchy. Archaeologists have crawled through their passages, documented their wall inscriptions, and analysed their grave goods until the cemetery's layout has become as familiar as a well-worn map. This was supposed to be the most transparent archaeological landscape in Egypt, a place where every stone had been accounted for and every mystery solved. The mastabas belonged to court officials, administrators, and family members of the pharaohs who built the Great Pyramids. Their construction followed known patterns, their purposes were clearly documented, and their relationship to the royal monuments was thoroughly understood. If anywhere at Giza could be considered archaeologically complete, it was here among these orderly tombs of the ancient elite. Yet in 2023, a team of Japanese researchers from Higashi Nippon International University and Tohoku University arrived at this supposedly familiar ground with a different perspective. Rather than focusing on the visible structures that had dominated archaeological attention for generations, they turned their ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity tomography equipment toward the spaces between the monuments, the seemingly empty patches of sand and limestone that everyone assumed held nothing of significance. What they discovered just 2 meters beneath the surface challenged every assumption about this thoroughly studied necropolis. The anomaly appeared on their screens as a distinct L-shaped formation buried beneath a thin layer of accumulated sand. The shape was too precise, too geometric to be natural. Natural rock formations don't create perfect right angles, and geological processes don't carve crisp L-shaped cavities in limestone bedrock. The structure showed clear evidence of human construction, but its position made no sense within the known layout of the cemetery. Even more puzzling was what the radar revealed directly beneath this shallow, L-shaped structure. At a depth of 5 to 10 meters below the surface, the scanning equipment detected a perfectly square cavity of similar dimensions. Another 10 meter by 10 meter void that appeared to be completely empty of the solid limestone that should have filled the space. This deeper anomaly showed the distinctive radar signature of an air-filled chamber rather than solid rock or packed earth. The discovery defied easy explanation. Mastaba tombs were built according to well-established architectural principles, with solid limestone foundations extending deep into the bedrock to ensure stability. The cemetery's construction patterns had been studied for decades, and nowhere in the archaeological record was there mention of L-shaped surface structures connected to square underground chambers. This wasn't part of any known Egyptian mortuary architecture. The positioning of the anomaly made it even more perplexing. rather than being located beneath one of the existing mastabas, where unusual structural features might be explained as part of the tomb's design. The L-shaped formation sat in what appeared to be empty space between the known monuments. It was as if someone had deliberately constructed an underground chamber system in a location designed to avoid detection by later tomb builders. When the Japanese team published their findings in archaeological research in Asia in 2023, they were careful to note several key details that distinguished their discovery from typical radar anomalies. The L-shaped structure showed clear signs of deliberate burial rather than natural accumulation of sand and debris. The precision of the geometry, the depth consistency, and the relationship between the surface and subsurface features all pointed to intentional human construction rather than geological accident. The discovery became even more intriguing when considered alongside local traditions and folklore that had persisted around Giza for centuries. Stories of hidden entrances and underground passages had circulated among local populations long before modern archaeological investigation began. These tales typically described concealed doorways that led to chambers beneath the plateau, passages that connected different areas of the complex, and ancient gateways that had been deliberately sealed to prevent access to dangerous or sacred spaces below. Most archaeologists had dismissed such stories as typical mythologizing of ancient sites, the kind of folklore that naturally accumulates around mysterious monuments over time. But the discovery of a deliberately concealed, geometrically precise structure in the cemetery gave these old stories new relevance. Could the L-shaped formation represent one of the legendary hidden entrances that local tradition insisted existed around Giza? The positioning of the anomaly within the Western Cemetery added another layer of significance to this possibility. The cemetery had always occupied a strategic location on the Giza Plateau, serving as a buffer zone between the royal pyramids and the edge of the plateau. If underground passages connected different areas of the complex, logical access points would be located in areas that appeared innocent on the surface, but provided discreet entry to hidden networks below. The careful concealment of the L-shaped structure also suggested sophisticated planning by whoever had built it, rather than simply sealing an entrance with stone blocks, which might attract attention from later builders. The concealment method preserved the surface appearance of normal limestone and sand accumulation. Only advanced scanning technology could detect the hidden geometry beneath, implying that the concealment was intended to be permanent and complete. Perhaps most significantly, the relationship between the shallow L-shaped structure and the deeper square chamber suggested they were components of a single integrated system rather than separate, unrelated features. The positioning implied that the surface structure might have served as an entrance or access point to the larger chamber below, possibly through a connecting passage or shaft that the radar had not yet clearly resolved. This possibility transformed the discovery from an isolated anomaly into potential evidence of a broader underground infrastructure that might extend throughout the cemetery and beyond. If the L-shaped formation was indeed an entrance to a hidden chamber system, it raised profound questions about the true nature of the Western Cemetery and its relationship to the larger Giza complex. Amid the weathered mastabas of the Western Cemetery today, looking across the familiar rows of limestone tombs toward the pyramids beyond, it becomes difficult to see this landscape as the simple, well-understood necropolis it once appeared to be. Somewhere beneath the ancient stones, if the Japanese team's findings prove accurate, a deliberate gateway waits in the darkness. A precisely engineered entrance that someone took great care to hide from discovery, holding secrets that only deliberate excavation might reveal. But as remarkable as these underground discoveries were, they paled before an even more fundamental mystery that had been hiding in plain sight for over 4 millennia, carved into the very heart of humanity's most ambitious ancient monument. When you step inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, climbing through its narrow passages toward the heart of humanity's most ambitious ancient construction project, you expect to encounter the builders, Not physically, of course, but through the traces they invariably leave behind. Inscriptions proclaiming royal glory, hieroglyphic accounts of construction methods, carved portraits of the pharaoh who commissioned the work, administrative records documenting the massive workforce required for such an undertaking. Every significant building project in ancient Egypt followed predictable patterns of documentation. Pharaohs inscribed their names and achievements on temple walls with obsessive detail. Administrative scribes recorded the movement of stones, the allocation of food rations, and the organization of work gangs with bureaucratic precision that would impress modern project managers. Royal monuments typically overflowed with self-congratulatory inscriptions, detailed accounts of construction challenges overcome, and elaborate descriptions of the divine inspiration behind each architectural decision. Yet when you reach the chambers at the heart of the Great Pyramid, you find something unprecedented in Egyptian architecture: silence. The walls are bare limestone, unmarked by any inscription. The chambers echo with emptiness, devoid of the carved reliefs and painted texts that fill every other significant monument from the same period. There are no royal cartouches, no descriptions of construction methodology, no acknowledgement of the enormous achievement the pyramid represents. This absence becomes more striking the longer you remain in these spaces. The King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber, and the Grand Gallery, the three most important interior spaces of what is arguably humanity's greatest ancient construction project, contain not a single hieroglyphic inscription explaining their purpose, commemorating their completion, or identifying their builder. It is as if the pyramid's creators deliberately chose to remain anonymous, leaving behind a monument that proclaims nothing about its origins. The silence extends beyond the pyramid's interior to the vast corpus of Egyptian administrative records. Ancient Egypt was a civilization built on documentation, where scribes recorded everything from the daily bread rations of individual workers to precise measurements of architectural projects. Royal building activities were documented with particular care, as they represented the pharaoh's divine mandate and served as propaganda for royal power and capability. Yet in thousands of surviving papyri temple inscriptions and administrative documents from the Old Kingdom period, there are no detailed accounts of the Great Pyramid's construction, no records of workforce organization, no descriptions of the engineering methods used to move and position the massive stone blocks, no administrative documents tracking the enormous quantities of material and labor that the project would have required. This documentary void becomes even more puzzling when compared to the extensive records that exist for smaller, less significant construction projects from the same period. Lesser pyramids, modest temples, and routine administrative buildings all left behind detailed paper trails documenting their planning, construction, and completion. Yet the Great Pyramid, which would have been the largest, most complex, and most resource-intensive project of its era, apparently proceeded without generating any surviving records of its creation. The only potential exception to this documentary silence is a series of small graffiti marks discovered in relieving chambers above the King's Chamber by British explorer Howard Vyse in 1837. These crude markings, painted in red ochre on rough stone surfaces, include what appears to be a cartouche of Pharaoh Khufu, along with other fragmentary inscriptions. For mainstream Egyptology, these markings provide the primary evidence linking the Great Pyramid to Khufu and establishing its construction date in the 4th dynasty, around 2580 BCE. Yet even this evidence has generated controversy since its discovery. The markings were found in spaces that had remained sealed since the pyramid's construction, accessible only after Vyse blasted his way through solid stone using gunpowder. The crude nature of the graffiti contrasts sharply with the precision and formality of official royal inscriptions found elsewhere in Egyptian architecture. Some researchers have questioned whether the markings represent official royal documentation or simply workers' graffiti that happen to include a pharaoh's name. Some investigators have noted inconsistencies in the hieroglyphic forms used in the graffiti, which don't perfectly match known 4th dynasty conventions for writing Khufu's name. A few researchers have gone so far as to suggest that Vyse himself might have created the inscriptions to support his theories about the pyramid's origins, though this accusation remains highly controversial and is rejected by mainstream Egyptology. Setting aside these controversies, even if the relieving chamber graffiti is accepted as authentic evidence of Khufu's involvement with the pyramid, it represents remarkably minimal documentation for such a massive undertaking. The markings appear to be informal notations rather than official royal inscriptions, and they provide no information about construction methods, workforce organisation, or the identity of the architects and engineers who planned and executed the project. This stands in stark contrast to the documentation patterns found at other royal construction sites. When Pharaoh Sneferu built his pyramids at Dashur, administrative records documented the organisation of work crews, the transportation of building materials, and the allocation of resources. Temple construction projects typically generated extensive inscriptions describing divine inspiration for the work, royal participation in planning processes, and ceremonial dedications upon completion. The Great Pyramid's silence on these matters becomes particularly significant when considered alongside the engineering sophistication the structure displays. The precision of its orientation to cardinal directions, the mathematical relationships embedded in its proportions, and the complex internal architecture all suggest planning and execution by individuals with advanced knowledge of engineering, astronomy, and mathematics. Yet there are no training manuals for pyramid construction. None of these master builders left their names or described their methods in any surviving record. Why would you, after building the greatest wonder of the ancient world, leave no mark of yourself behind, unless you believed you were never truly worthy of it? This pattern has led some researchers to propose a radical alternative interpretation, that the Egyptians of Khufu's era inherited rather than created the Great Pyramid. In this view, the monument represents the work of an earlier civilization or culture whose identity has been lost to history, and the 4th dynasty Egyptians simply adopted and maintained a structure that already existed on the Giza plateau. Such a theory would explain several puzzling aspects of the Great Pyramid's history. The absence of construction records would make sense if the Egyptians had no construction process to document. The lack of builder identification would be natural if the actual builders belonged to a different culture entirely. The sophisticated engineering techniques would not need to be explained by 4th dynasty capabilities if they originated in an earlier period with different technological development. This interpretation also accounts for the unique characteristics that distinguish the Great Pyramid from other Egyptian pyramids. While later pyramid construction followed relatively consistent patterns and showed gradual technological development, the Great Pyramid stands apart in its precision, scale, and internal complexity. Rather than representing the pinnacle of a developmental sequence, it appears as an isolated achievement that was never successfully replicated. If the Great Pyramid was indeed inherited rather than built by the 4th dynasty, it would represent the most spectacular example of this pattern. The monument would stand as evidence of capabilities that existed before the historical period, documented by surviving Egyptian records, preserved by a civilization sophisticated enough to maintain and venerate structures whose origins they might not have fully understood. The Great Pyramid stands today as a monument not just to human engineering capability, but to the fragility of historical memory itself. In its unmarked chambers and undocumented construction, it preserves the ultimate mystery, a supreme achievement whose creators chose anonymity, or whose identity was lost to forces that consumed not just their names, but every trace of their existence except the impossible monument they left behind. Yet if the Great Pyramid's origins remain shrouded in documentary silence, its ancient companion on the Giza plateau tells an even more startling story, one written not in hieroglyphs, but in the very stone itself. The riddle of who built the pyramids is matched by the riddle of how the Sphinx came to be. Most visitors to the Sphinx see only what they expect to see, a monument weathered by thousands of years of desert wind and sand, its limestone surface carved into gentle curves by the endless patience of Saharan erosion. The great stone lion crouches in eternal vigilance, its features softened by time and elements, telling a familiar story of gradual decay under the relentless Egyptian sun. Tourists photograph the wind-carved features and sand-polished surfaces, carrying away images of a monument shaped by the harsh, dry climate that has defined this region for millennia. The weathering appears consistent with everything we know about the Sahara, a vast desert that has baked under merciless sunshine for thousands of years, sculpting stone through the abrasive action of wind-blown sand. Yet when geologists examine the Sphinx more closely, particularly the deep vertical channels that score its body and the weathered walls of the enclosure surrounding it, they observe erosion patterns that tell a very different story. The stone surfaces show characteristics that geologists recognize as the unmistakable signature of water erosion, the kind of deep flowing cuts that form only when large volumes of moving water interact with rock over extended periods. These vertical channels and rounded stone profiles don't match the horizontal scoring and angular weathering patterns typically created by wind and sand. Instead, they display the smooth flowing characteristics that develop when rainwater runs down vertical surfaces, carving channels, and rounding edges through the persistent action of water flow. The pattern is familiar to geologists who study erosion in regions with significant rainfall, but it appears strikingly out of place in one of the world's most arid environments. The puzzle deepens when this erosion evidence is considered against the climatic history of the Giza region. For the past 4,500 years, the entire span of documented Egyptian civilization, the area around Giza has experienced minimal rainfall. Modern precipitation measurements show annual totals measured in millimeters rather than inches, with some years receiving no significant rainfall at all. This extreme aridity has characterized the region throughout the historical period, making it highly unlikely that natural water erosion could have created the patterns visible on the Sphinx. The implications of this mismatch between observed erosion and known climate conditions are profound. If the water erosion patterns on the Sphinx required extended exposure to significant rainfall, the monument must have been carved during a period when the local environment was fundamentally different from the arid desert that visitors see today. This would place the Sphinx's creation in a much earlier era, when the Sahara region experienced the kind of abundant precipitation that could create the observed geological effects. Such a scenario challenges the conventional dating that places the Sphinx's creation around 2550 BCE during the 4th dynasty reign of Pharaoh Khafre. Instead, the geological evidence suggests the monument might have been carved during the period geologists call the Green Sahara, a time roughly 1,000 to 5,000 years ago when the entire Saharan region experienced dramatically different climatic conditions. During this Green Sahara period, the landscape that is now the world's largest hot desert was covered with grasslands, lakes and rivers. Archaeological evidence from across the Sahara reveals the remains of fishing communities, cattle herders and agricultural societies that thrived in what was then a lush, well-watered environment. Rock art from this period depicts abundant wildlife, including elephants, giraffes and hippos in regions that are now barren desert. If the Sphinx was indeed carved during this earlier, wetter period, it would represent far more than a simple chronological revision. The monument would emerge as evidence of sophisticated stoneworking capabilities among people who lived in the Sahara before the climate shift that created the modern desert. These earlier inhabitants would have possessed the technical skills and cultural motivation to undertake the massive project of carving a monument from living rock, suggesting a level of social organization and artistic achievement that predates known Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. The most prominent advocate for this water erosion hypothesis has been geologist Dr. Robert Schoch of Boston University. who first presented his analysis in the early 1990s. Schoch examined the Sphinx and its enclosure extensively, documenting the vertical erosion channels and comparing them with erosion patterns created by known geological processes. His conclusion was unambiguous. The weathering patterns on the Sphinx could only have been created by prolonged exposure to significant rainfall, not by the wind and sand erosion that has characterized the region during historical times. Schoch's work gained additional credibility from his careful analysis of different parts of the Sphinx complex. He noted that the body of the Sphinx, which would have been exposed to weather throughout its existence, shows more pronounced water erosion than the head, which has been recarved multiple times and therefore shows more recent weathering patterns. The original construction stones of the enclosure walls display the most dramatic water erosion effects, while later repair work using different materials shows erosion patterns more consistent with the arid conditions of recent millennia. This differential weathering provides what Schoch considers compelling evidence for his timeline. The most ancient parts of the monument show the most water erosion, while progressively newer elements show less. Exactly what would be expected if the original carving took place during a wetter climate period and subsequent modifications occurred during increasingly arid conditions. Yet Schoch's conclusions have faced substantial criticism from both Egyptologists and some fellow geologists. Critics argue that other processes could potentially create similar erosion patterns without requiring a dramatically different climate. Salt weathering, where dissolved minerals crystallize and expand within rock pores, can create some types of vertical channeling. Subsurface water movement, wind-driven sand abrasion, and chemical weathering processes might combine to produce effects that could be mistaken for water erosion. Some geologists have also questioned whether the observed erosion necessarily requires the kind of extended, heavy rainfall that Schoch's timeline would imply. They suggest that occasional flash floods, seasonal water accumulation, or even condensation and evaporation cycles might create similar patterns without requiring a fundamental shift in regional climates. More broadly, critics point to the absence of supporting archaeological evidence for a sophisticated civilization in the Sahara during the proposed earlier time period. While the Green Sahara period definitely supported human populations, the archaeological record from that era consists primarily of stone tools, cave paintings, and modest settlements rather than evidence of the advanced capabilities that creating the Sphinx would have required. Mainstream Egyptology has been particularly resistant to Schoch's conclusions, arguing that accepting them would require abandoning not just the conventional dating of the Sphinx, but much of the established understanding of how Egyptian civilization developed. The Sphinx has long been considered an integral part of Khafre's pyramid complex, and removing it from that context would necessitate fundamental revisions to theories about Old Kingdom architecture, religious practices, and cultural continuity. Yet the geological evidence itself remains difficult to dismiss entirely. Independent researchers who have examined the Sphinx have generally confirmed Schoch's basic observations about the nature of the erosion patterns, even when they disagree about their implications. The vertical channeling and rounded weathering characteristics are clearly visible and do resemble patterns created by water erosion in other geological contexts. The debate has been further complicated by discoveries of ancient lake beds and river channels in the Sahara that confirm the region's dramatically different climatic past. Satellite imagery and ground surveys have revealed extensive networks of ancient waterways throughout what is now desert, providing clear evidence that the area once supported the kind of abundant water resources that could create significant erosion effects. The weathering patterns of the Sphinx today tell their story without words, inscribed in stone by processes that operate according to physical laws rather than political or academic preferences. Whether mainstream archaeology ultimately accepts or rejects Schoch's interpretation, the erosion evidence remains visible to anyone who examines the monument closely. A permanent record written in the language of geology across thousands of years. If the stone speaks truly, the Sphinx has stood sentinel through a transformation so complete that the very climate that shaped its surface has vanished, replaced by an environment so different that its original creators would barely recognize the landscape they once knew. In the deep channels and rounded profiles of its weathered limestone, the monument preserves not just the memory of ancient reigns, but the possibility of an entire lost world that flourished and disappeared before history began. This geological testimony of ancient waters finds an unexpected echo 300 miles to the south, where another monument speaks of construction techniques that seem to belong to an entirely different world. 300 miles south of Giza, in the ancient sacred city of Abydos, visitors come to admire one of Egypt's most beautifully decorated temples. The Temple of Seti draws crowds with its exquisite relief carvings, painted hieroglyphs that retain their colours after 3 millennia, and architectural proportions that represent New Kingdom Egyptian art at its finest. The temple tells familiar stories in familiar ways: pharaonic power, divine favour, religious devotion expressed through the sophisticated artistic conventions that define ancient Egyptian aesthetics. Yet directly behind this showcase of conventional Egyptian architecture lies something that seems to belong to an entirely different world. Buried beneath accumulated sand and debris, accessible only through a narrow entrance that most tourists never notice, extends a massive underground structure that challenges every assumption about architectural development in ancient Egypt. The Osirian, as archaeologists have named it, presents construction so fundamentally different from the temple above that early excavators wondered if they had discovered the remains of a completely different civilization. When British archaeologists first uncovered portions of the Osirian between 1902 and 1903, they found themselves looking at architecture that defied classification within known Egyptian building traditions. The structure consisted of enormous chambers built from massive blocks of red granite and sandstone, some weighing dozens of tons, fitted together with precision but without the decorative elements, painted surfaces, or detailed hieroglyphic inscriptions that characterized virtually every other Egyptian religious building. The scale of the construction was breathtaking. Individual stone blocks measured 15 feet in length and weighed more than most buildings. Yet they had been cut, transported, and positioned with mathematical precision to create underground chambers of cathedral-like proportions. The walls rose 20 feet or more without visible mortar, held in place by the sheer weight and perfect fitting of the massive stones. Water channels surrounded the central chamber, creating an island-like structure that could be accessed only by narrow walkways. Perhaps most remarkably, the Osirian appeared to have been deliberately built without a roof. Unlike the carefully enclosed spaces that defined Egyptian temple architecture, this underground complex was designed as an open-air structure, exposed to the sky despite being situated far below ground level. The combination of massive stone construction, underground positioning, and open-air design created an architectural concept that had no parallel in known Egyptian building traditions. The stark contrast with the Temple of Seti above could hardly have been more dramatic. Where the temple displayed the refined decorative sensibilities of New Kingdom art, the Osirian showcased raw monumental stonework that relied on mass and proportion rather than surface decoration for its effect. Where the temple walls carried elaborate inscriptions documenting royal achievements and religious ceremonies, the Osirian surfaces remained largely blank, marked only by occasional later additions that appeared to have been carved into already existing walls. The architectural styles seemed to represent not just different approaches to building design, but different concepts of what sacred architecture should accomplish. The temple above followed established patterns of Egyptian religious building, creating enclosed spaces for ritual activities decorated with imagery and texts that reinforced traditional religious and political messages. The structure below suggested entirely different priorities: monumental permanence achieved through massive stone construction, symbolic relationships with water and sky, and architectural effects that relied on space and proportion rather than decorative elaboration. Mainstream Egyptology has addressed these striking differences by interpreting the Osirian as an intentional archasing project commissioned by Seti I to create a symbolic tomb for the god Osiris. According to this interpretation, the pharaoh deliberately chose an archaic architectural style to evoke the primordial character of Osiris as a deity associated with death, rebirth, and the earliest periods of Egyptian religious development. The massive stone construction and unusual design elements would represent conscious artistic choices rather than evidence of different construction periods. This explanation draws support from the architectural alignment between the temple and the underground structure, which suggests coordinated planning between the two construction projects. The Osirian central axis aligns precisely with the temple above, creating a unified ceremonial complex that connects the visible temple spaces with the hidden chambers below. Such precise coordination would seem to indicate contemporary construction rather than the adaptation of pre-existing structures. Yet several aspects of the Osirian continue to resist easy integration into conventional New Kingdom chronology. The massive stone construction techniques used in the underground chambers represent capabilities that seem to exceed rather than reflect typical building methods from Seti's period. The precision required to cut, transport, and position granite blocks weighing dozens of tons would have challenged even the most capable New Kingdom builders. Yet the Osirian displays such techniques as standard construction methods throughout the structure. Some researchers have noted striking similarities between the Osirian's construction techniques and megalithic building traditions found in other parts of the ancient world. The use of enormous stone blocks fitted together without mortar, the precise cutting and positioning of massive materials, and the creation of monumental architecture through sheer scale rather than decorative elaboration, all echo construction methods associated with prehistoric megalithic builders in Europe, South America, and other regions. These parallels have led some investigators to propose that the Osirian represents an example of much earlier construction techniques that either survived longer in Egypt than previously recognized or were deliberately revived during the New Kingdom for unknown reasons. Either interpretation would require significant revision of established understanding about technological development and cultural continuity in ancient Egypt. The water damage evidence has proven particularly difficult to explain within conventional chronology. If the Osirian was constructed during Seti's reign around 1290 BCE, the extensive water erosion would require explanation through exceptional flood events or unusual hydrological conditions that don't align with known environmental conditions during that period. The erosion patterns suggest prolonged exposure to flowing water rather than occasional flooding, implying either that the structure is much older than conventionally dated or that environmental conditions in the Abydos region were dramatically different during the New Kingdom than historical records suggest. Alternative researchers have proposed that the Osirian represents another example of the pattern observed at Giza, where later Egyptian builders constructed their monuments around or above pre-existing structures of unknown origin. In this interpretation, Seti I discovered the underground chambers already existing at Abydos and incorporated them into his temple complex, adding inscriptions and ceremonial elements to adapt the ancient structure for New Kingdom religious purposes. This reuse scenario would explain both the architectural anomalies and the precise alignment between temple and underground structure. Rather than representing coordinated construction, the alignment would reflect careful adaptation of newer building plans to accommodate existing infrastructure. The inscriptional evidence linking the Osirian to Seti I would represent modification rather than original construction, documenting the pharaoh's appropriation and reuse of ancient architecture for contemporary religious purposes. Such an interpretation transforms understanding of Seti's building activities from original creation to sophisticated adaptation, suggesting that New Kingdom pharaohs were as much archaeologists as architects, incorporating ancient monuments into their building programs through careful restoration and recontextualization. This pattern would align with evidence from other Egyptian sites, where later builders clearly adapted or modified earlier constructions for their own purposes. In the chambers of the Osirian today, surrounded by walls of massive granite blocks that seem to emerge from the bedrock itself, the structure's true age and origin remain as mysterious as when archaeologists first uncovered it over a century ago. The stone surfaces tell no stories in conventional hieroglyphic texts, preserve no royal cartouches to establish clear chronology, and display no decorative elements that would allow stylistic dating according to established Egyptian artistic periods. The Osirian stands as a monument to the possibility that Egypt's greatest architectural achievements might represent not the pinnacle of indigenous development, but the adaptation and preservation of construction traditions whose origins reach back to periods and peoples that have vanished entirely from historical memory. Yet perhaps the most tantalizing evidence for such vanished civilizations lies not in what has been excavated, but in what modern technology suggests still waits beneath the most famous monument of all. For over 2 millennia, persistent legends have whispered of a hidden chamber beneath the Great Sphinx of Giza, a repository of ancient knowledge sealed away from the world above. Ancient Egyptian texts hint at secret chambers connected to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, while Greek and Roman sources describe mysterious vaults beneath Egypt's most famous monuments, where the knowledge of vanished civilizations was preserved for future discovery. These stories have echoed through centuries of folklore, dismissed by serious scholars as the inevitable mythologizing that surrounds ancient sites, yet never quite fading from popular consciousness. In the 20th century, these ancient legends found an unlikely champion in Edgar Cayce, an American psychic whose trances allegedly revealed detailed visions of a hall of records hidden beneath the Sphinx. According to Cayce's readings, delivered between 1923 and 1944, this chamber contained the complete historical records of Atlantis, including technological knowledge and spiritual wisdom that would revolutionize human understanding when finally discovered. Cayce predicted the hall would be found before the end of the 20th century, ushering in a new age of human enlightenment based on recovered ancient knowledge. Mainstream archaeology dismissed Cayce's predictions as fantasy, products of an overactive imagination influenced by popular Egyptian mysticism rather than any genuine historical insight. The idea that sophisticated recording systems could have existed before known Egyptian civilization seemed to contradict established understanding of human technological development. No ancient civilization, scholars argued, possessed the capabilities or motivation to create elaborate underground libraries, particularly not for preserving records of mythical lost continents. Yet as modern scanning technology began probing beneath the Giza plateau, an unexpected pattern emerged that gave new relevance to the old legends. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted from the 1970s onward consistently detected anomalous voids and chamber-like spaces in the bedrock surrounding the Sphinx. These weren't the random cavities that geological processes might create, but geometric spaces that suggested deliberate excavation and construction. The earliest systematic radar surveys of the Sphinx area, conducted by Japanese researchers in the 1980s, revealed multiple subsurface anomalies that appeared to be artificial chambers. The team detected rectangular voids beneath the pores of the Sphinx, along with what appeared to be connecting passages that extended toward other parts of the Giza complex. When they published their findings, the researchers were careful to avoid sensational interpretations, noting only that the detected spaces warranted further investigation to determine their nature and origin. More sophisticated scanning efforts in subsequent decades confirmed and expanded these initial discoveries. Ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and other non-invasive detection methods repeatedly identified subsurface chambers in the Sphinx area that displayed characteristics consistent with artificial construction. The spaces appeared to have regular geometric shapes, clear boundaries, and connecting passages that suggested they were components of a larger underground network. The most significant confirmation came from the Scan Pyramids project, launched in 2015, which employed multiple advanced detection methods to survey the entire Giza complex. While the project's most publicized discovery was the large void detected within the Great Pyramid itself, the surveys also identified numerous anomalous spaces around the Sphinx and throughout the plateau. These chambers appeared to be part of the broader underground infrastructure that researchers had been detecting piecemeal for decades. By 2025, the accumulated radar evidence had created a compelling case for the existence of substantial underground construction in the Sphinx area. The detected chambers weren't random geological features, but appeared to represent deliberate architectural spaces that had remained sealed since their creation. Their positioning relative to the surface monuments suggested they were integral components of the overall Giza complex, rather than isolated features. The characteristics of these underground spaces aligned remarkably with the ancient descriptions of hidden knowledge repositories. The chambers appeared to be designed for storage and preservation, with controlled access through narrow passages that would have protected their contents from environmental damage and unauthorized entry. Their positioning beneath the Sphinx specifically echoed the persistent legends that had placed such repositories in exactly that location. The persistence of Hall of Records legends across multiple cultures and time periods adds another dimension to the mystery. Ancient Egyptian texts describe secret chambers where the wisdom of early dynasties was preserved against the destruction of war and time. Greek sources reference hidden libraries beneath Egyptian temples where initiates could study the knowledge of civilizations that predated recorded history. Roman writers describe underground repositories where the secrets of Egyptian religion and science were maintained by successive generations of priests. These diverse sources suggest that belief in hidden knowledge chambers at Giza wasn't a modern invention, but represented genuine, ancient traditions that were maintained across different cultures and historical periods. While such traditions don't constitute proof of the chamber's existence, they indicate that the idea of underground repositories had deep roots in ancient consciousness rather than originating from contemporary mythology. The specific association with Thoth in Egyptian sources provides additional cultural context for understanding why such repositories might have been created. As the god of writing, mathematics, and sacred knowledge, Thoth was believed to be the recorder of divine wisdom and the patron of all intellectual pursuits. Ancient texts describe Thoth creating books of wisdom that contain the fundamental principles governing the universe, preserved for those worthy of accessing such knowledge. If chambers beneath the Sphinx were indeed dedicated to Thoth and designed for preserving sacred knowledge, they would represent the physical manifestation of one of ancient Egypt's most important religious concepts. Such spaces would have served not just as storage areas, but as sacred sites where the continuity of wisdom was maintained across generations through carefully controlled access by qualified priests and initiates. Recent discoveries of elaborate underground infrastructure throughout the Giza complex provide additional context for understanding how extensive repositories might have been created. If the detected spiral staircases, massive chambers, and water management systems represent genuine ancient construction, they would have provided the technological foundation for creating specialized storage and study areas within the overall underground network. The Hall of Records may remain beyond physical reach, protected by Egyptian authorities and buried beneath tons of stone and sand. Yet the coincidence between legendary descriptions of hidden knowledge, repositories, and modern detection of actual underground chambers raises profound questions about the relationship between mythology and historical memory. Either the legends preserved accurate information about real ancient constructions across thousands of years of cultural transmission, or modern discoveries have occurred in precisely the locations where ancient imagination placed mythical repositories. If sophisticated recording and storage systems existed before known Egyptian civilization, they would suggest that advanced intellectual traditions developed much earlier than conventional scholarship recognizes. The knowledge preserved in such repositories might represent not just Egyptian wisdom, but the accumulated understanding of civilizations that flourished before the catastrophes that ended earlier ages of human achievement. In the shadows beneath the Sphinx, chambers wait in darkness, their contents known only to the stone that surrounds them. Whether they hold the records of Atlantis, as Casey claimed, the wisdom of Thoth, as ancient texts suggest, or simply the accumulated knowledge of forgotten peoples, their very existence challenges our assumptions about the antiquity and continuity of human civilization. These technological mysteries find their counterpart in the realm of historical memory, where the ancient Egyptians themselves preserve traditions that may hold keys to understanding their true origins. When archaeology and geology fail to resolve the riddles of Giza, and further inquiry is actively obstructed by modern authorities, the search often drifts toward older voices, the myths once dismissed as legend. In the ancient city of Heliopolis, just northeast of modern Cairo, where the morning sun first touched the sacred temples of Ra, priests whispered of a time that belonged to no pharaoh and preceded all recorded dynasties. They called it Zep-Tepi, the first time, a golden age when gods walked the earth as living rulers, and the foundations of all creation were laid by divine hands. This wasn't folklore relegated to the margins of Egyptian belief, but the central pillar of their religious understanding, the bedrock upon which all pharaonic authority was built. According to these sacred traditions, the world began when the primordial mound of Benben emerged from the chaotic waters of Nun, that boundless ocean of potential that existed before creation. Upon this first solid ground, the god Atum brought himself into existence through an act of pure will, becoming the source from which all other gods, all life, and all order would flow. The pyramid texts, carved into the walls of Old Kingdom burial chambers, preserve these creation accounts with reverent detail, describing not mythical allegory, but the actual sequence of events that established the cosmic order. From Atum came the first divine generation, Shu, god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture, who together created the basic elements necessary for life. They gave birth to Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, whose union produced the gods who would rule directly over human affairs. Osiris became the first divine king, ruling alongside his sister wife Isis, while their siblings Seth and Nephthys completed the divine council that governed the world during humanity's earliest period. These weren't vague mythological figures existing in some timeless realm separate from earthly affairs. The Egyptian texts described them as actual rulers who governed from real palaces, established laws, taught humanity the arts of civilization, and maintained their authority through recognizable royal dynasties that followed clear succession patterns. The gods had royal names, royal titles, and royal relationships that mirror the political structures of later pharaonic rule so closely that they read more like historical chronicles than religious mythology. The detailed nature of these accounts creates a fundamental tension within Egyptian historical consciousness. Every official king list begins with Nama or Menes, the pharaoh traditionally credited with unifying Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE and establishing the first human dynasty. Yet the religious texts that form the core of Egyptian spiritual life consistently describe extensive periods of divine rule that preceded any human pharaoh by thousands of years. This contradiction runs deeper than simple chronological disagreement. The divine dynasties of Zep-Tepi weren't described as ruling in some heavenly realm separate from earthly concerns, but as governing Egypt itself, the same geographical region, the same Nile River, the same landscapes that later pharaohs would claim as their inheritance. The religious texts suggest that human pharaohs were not the first rulers of Egypt, but successors to a much longer tradition of kingship that extended back to the very beginning of time. Mainstream Egyptology has traditionally resolved this contradiction by interpreting Zep-Tepi as purely ceremonial fiction, a mythological framework created by priests to legitimize pharaonic authority by connecting earthly rulers with divine origins. In this view, the detailed genealogies and succession narratives of the divine dynasties represent sophisticated theological constructions rather than historical memories, designed to provide cosmic validation for political power. The pyramid texts and later coffin texts that preserve these traditions are typically interpreted as religious literature focused on ensuring successful afterlife journeys for deceased pharaohs rather than historical documents intended to preserve factual accounts of Egypt's earliest periods. Yet this dismissal of Zep-Tepi as pure mythology faces increasingly difficult challenges when examined alongside the physical evidence that has emerged from investigation of Egypt's most ancient monuments. The detailed genealogical nature of the divine succession accounts doesn't match the typical characteristics of mythological narratives, which tend towards symbolic generalization rather than specific historical detail. The consistency of these accounts across multiple sources and time periods suggests they preserve genuine traditions rather than invented fiction. Moreover, the geographical specificity of Zep-Tepi traditions creates additional problems for purely mythological interpretation. The texts don't describe divine rule occurring in some vague otherworldly realm, but locate the activities of the first-time gods in recognizable Egyptian locations. Heliopolis itself was considered the site where Atum first emerged from the primordial waters, while other specific locations throughout Egypt were associated with particular divine rulers and their achievements. When these traditional accounts are considered alongside the anomalous evidence that has emerged from modern investigation of ancient Egyptian monuments, Zep-Tepi begins to look less like religious fiction and more like cultural memory preserved in mythological form. The inventory, Stella's claim that Khufu restored rather than built the Sphinx, suggests that even pharaonic Egyptians recognized inheriting monuments from earlier periods. The water erosion evidence on the Sphinx indicates construction during climatic conditions that preceded known Egyptian civilization. The sophisticated underground architecture detected at Giza implies engineering capabilities that seem to exceed 4th Dynasty technological profiles. The proximity of Heliopolis to Giza adds another layer of significance to these connections. The ancient city where Zep-Tepi traditions were most carefully preserved lies just a few miles from the plateau where the most anomalous architectural evidence appears. If the great monuments of Giza do indeed preserve remnants of pre-dynastic construction, they would represent the physical embodiment of the first time that Heliopolitan priests described in their sacred texts. This geographical relationship suggests that Zep-Tepi traditions might have developed specifically to explain monuments and technological capabilities that pharaonic Egyptians inherited but did not create. Rather than inventing mythological explanations for divine authority, the priests might have been preserving genuine historical memories of earlier builders whose achievements exceeded anything that contemporary Egyptians could accomplish independently. The divine rulers described in these traditions would represent not mythological figures, but actual leaders of societies that possessed advanced architectural and engineering capabilities. The gods who taught humanity the arts of civilization might have been the builders of monuments whose sophisticated construction techniques later Egyptians could maintain but not replicate. The cyclical nature of Egyptian religious thought, with its emphasis on eternal recurrence and cosmic renewal, would have provided an ideal framework for preserving historical memories across vast periods of time. Rather than creating fictional mythologies, Egyptian priests might have been preserving the only available accounts of how their civilization had acquired capabilities that clearly exceeded their contemporary technological development. The divine dynasties of Zep-Tepi, in this interpretation, weren't just mythological constructions, but the mechanism through which Egyptian culture maintained awareness of its debt to earlier achievements, while incorporating those achievements into contemporary religious and political systems. The priests of Heliopolis, who whispered of Zep-Tepi across thousands of years, might have been performing a function more complex than simple religious mythology. They might have been maintaining humanity's memory of its own forgotten capabilities, preserving in sacred tradition the knowledge that current civilization was not the beginning of human achievement, but represented a recovery from much greater heights that had been reached and lost in ages so remote that only divine metaphor could preserve their memory. In the carved walls of ancient temples and the whispered traditions of long-dead priests, Zep Tepi preserves what might be humanity's oldest historical testimony, the acknowledgement that we once achieved more than we remember, built greater monuments than we can explain, and possessed knowledge that we have spent millennia trying to recover. These ancient memories of divine rulers and lost golden ages may preserve more than mythology. They might contain the cultural echo of an actual catastrophe that swept away earlier civilizations. Some scholars argue that if a lost civilization once thrived beneath what is now the sands of Giza, its disappearance may trace back to a cataclysmic flood, followed by the slow desertification that buried its ruins under endless dunes. Across the vast distances that separate human cultures and the millennia that divide historical periods, one story appears with a remarkable consistency in the collective memory of our species. From the windswept plains of ancient Mesopotamia to the mountain valleys of the Himalayas, from the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples in the Americas to the sacred texts that form the foundation of world religions, humanity preserves the same haunting recollection. The world was once consumed by waters that swept away everything that came before. These aren't merely similar stories that evolved through cultural contact and diffusion. They emerge from civilizations separated by vast distances and periods, yet they share core elements that suggest common origins in actual historical experience. The Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Babylon tells of Utnapishtim, who survived a divine flood in an ark. The Bible preserves Noah's account of waters that covered the highest mountains. Hindu scriptures describe Manu, who saved humanity from a deluge that destroyed the previous world. Norse mythology speaks of a great flood that drowned all but a handful of survivors. Modern geological science has revealed evidence that challenges the comfortable assumption that these stories represent only imagination and folklore. Approximately 12,800 years ago, during the period geologists call the Younger Dryas, the Earth experienced one of the most rapid and dramatic climate changes in geological history. Within the span of a few decades, global temperatures plunged, ice sheets advanced and retreated, and sea levels fluctuated dramatically across the planet. The Younger Dryas period, lasting roughly 1,300 years, represents a massive disruption in the relatively stable climate conditions that had characterized the preceding millennia. Ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica reveals that temperatures changed by as much as 15 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions within a matter of years, not centuries. Such rapid climate shifts would have triggered massive glacial melting, sudden changes in ocean currents, and catastrophic flooding in coastal and river valley regions where human populations were concentrated. The geological evidence extends far beyond simple temperature records. Massive flood deposits found across North America, Asia, and Europe indicate that enormous volumes of water moved across landscapes that are now dry land, carrying debris and sediment hundreds of miles from their origins. These deposits show characteristics of sudden catastrophic flooding rather than gradual sea level changes, suggesting that vast areas were inundated rapidly by waters that receded equally quickly. Perhaps most significantly, marine fossils and seafloor sediments appear at elevations and locations that can only be explained by temporary flooding that carried ocean water far inland before retreating. These geological fingerprints indicate that the Younger Dryas period involved not just climate change, but actual massive flooding events that would have been precisely the kind of catastrophic inundation that flood traditions describe. The timing of these geological events coincides remarkably with the period when archaeological evidence suggests that human civilization was undergoing fundamental transitions. The end of the last ice age marked the beginning of agriculture, the development of permanent settlements, and the emergence of the complex societies that would eventually produce the first known civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China. Yet this traditional narrative of gradual human development contains puzzling gaps and inconsistencies that become more apparent when viewed alongside evidence for catastrophic flooding. Many of the technological and architectural capabilities that define early civilization appear suddenly in the archaeological record without clear developmental sequences that would explain how such sophisticated achievements evolved from simpler predecessors. The mystery becomes particularly acute when applied to the monuments and underground structures detected at Giza. The precision of the pyramid construction, the mathematical knowledge embedded in their proportions, and the engineering capabilities required for the underground chambers all suggest capabilities that exceed what conventional archaeology attributes to early dynastic Egypt. If the Giza complex represents not the beginning of Egyptian achievement, but the surviving remnant of an earlier civilization that was largely destroyed during the Younger Dryas flooding, many of these anomalies begin to make sense. The monuments would represent not innovations but preservation, the portions of a much larger civilization that survived catastrophic destruction because of their elevated position, massive construction, or deliberate protection. The water erosion evidence on the Sphinx takes on new significance in this context. Rather than indicating construction during a different climate period, the erosion might preserve evidence of the actual flooding that destroyed the civilization that created it. The deep channels and rounded weathering patterns could represent not gradual erosion over millennia, but damage caused by the massive water flows that swept across the region during the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Archaeological evidence from around the world supports the possibility that advanced human societies existed before the Younger Dryas period and were disrupted or destroyed by the climate changes and flooding of that era. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, with its sophisticated astronomical alignments and massive stone construction dating to the end of the Ice Age, demonstrate that complex civilizations existed precisely during the period when geological evidence indicates catastrophic flooding occurred. Modern coastal archaeology provides additional evidence for sudden sea level changes that would have destroyed early human settlements underwater. Archaeological discoveries off the coasts of India, the Mediterranean, and other regions reveal sophisticated structures and settlements that were clearly built on dry land but are now submerged beneath substantial depths of water. These sites indicate that significant human populations and their architectural achievements were indeed lost to rising waters, just as flood traditions describe. The implications of accepting catastrophic flooding as historical reality extend far beyond simple chronological revision. If advanced human civilizations existed before the Younger Dryas and were largely destroyed by flooding, the entire framework for understanding human technological and cultural development requires fundamental reconsideration. Modern civilization might represent not the first flowering of human achievement, but a recovery from much more severe setbacks than conventional history acknowledges. The knowledge and capabilities that we consider uniquely modern might represent not innovations but rediscoveries of understanding that was once common but was lost when the waters rose and swept away the cities, libraries, and accumulated wisdom of earlier ages. The flood stories that echo through human culture might preserve not mythological imagination, but the traumatic memory of actual catastrophe that reduced a sophisticated global civilization to scattered survivors clinging to boats, mountains, and isolated refugees. These survivors would have carried fragments of earlier knowledge into the post-flood world, seeding the recovery of civilization with memories and capabilities that seemed miraculous to their descendants, who had never known the achievements of the world that drowned. In the deepest chambers beneath Giza, if they indeed exist as the radar suggests, the waters of the Great Flood might have sealed away not just ancient artifacts, but the last physical evidence of capabilities that humanity achieved once before and lost to forces beyond their control. The monuments that survived above ground would stand as monuments not just to human ambition, but to human endurance, testimony that even when the world ends in water and darkness, something precious can be preserved for those who come after. The silence of the deep chambers, if it ever ends, might break not with the voice of forgotten pharaohs, but with the whispers of an entire world that was lost when the floods came and the last golden age of humanity disappeared beneath the waves. The underground chambers wait in their sealed darkness, the detected voids remain unexplored, and the anomalous evidence accumulates in research reports that conclude with the same recurring phrase, "Further investigation pending approval." In the land of the pharaohs, some secrets are protected not by the passage of time, but by the persistent refusal to seek the truth they might contain. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of this situation is the possibility that Egyptian authorities already know what lies beneath the sands and have made a deliberate decision that some discoveries are too dangerous to share with the world. If the underground chambers do contain evidence of pre-dynastic civilizations with capabilities that exceed those traditionally attributed to ancient Egypt, the implications would extend far beyond archaeological revision to challenge fundamental assumptions about human development and historical continuity. In such a scenario, the politics of buried truth becomes not just a matter of academic control, but of protecting a version of human history that serves contemporary, political, and cultural needs, even at the cost of suppressing evidence that might revolutionize our understanding of our own past. As we emerge from the shadows of these ancient mysteries, we find ourselves standing at the threshold between known history and something far more extraordinary. We've journeyed through the spiral chambers that may wind beneath Khafre's pyramid, discovered hidden gateways in the cemetery of nobles, and contemplated the silence of monuments whose builders left no trace of their identity. We've seen how water carved its testimony into the Sphinx during ages when the desert bloomed, witnessed architecture that defies conventional chronology at Abydos, and explored the technological detection of chambers that ancient legends insisted were always there. Through the mythical memories of Zep-Tepi and the geological evidence of catastrophic floods, we've glimpsed the possibility that our civilization stands not at the beginning of human achievement, but in the long shadow of capabilities we once possessed and lost. And perhaps most troubling of all, we've seen how modern politics may be actively preventing us from learning the full truth about our own past. Do you believe the pyramids hide a lost ancient civilization underneath? If the radar doesn't lie, if the water erosion speaks truly, if the ancient traditions preserve actual memories rather than mere mythology, then beneath sands of Egypt lies something extraordinary. Perhaps not just stone, not just chambers, but the memory of a civilization older than history itself. The question that haunts the darkness of those sealed chambers is not just what we have found, but what else lies waiting to be uncovered, and why some seem so determined not to find out. What do you think lies waiting in the deep chambers beneath the pyramids? Lost knowledge of a forgotten civilization, or simply the echoes of our eternal human need to believe we once achieved something greater than ourselves? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this journey through the mysteries of ancient Egypt has intrigued you, please give this video a like and subscribe for more explorations of the hidden corners of human history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and never stop seeking the truth that lies buried beneath the surface of accepted knowledge. Sweet dreams, fellow guardians of human wisdom.